My son yelled at me to apologize to his mother-in-law or get out of his house. I stood up and stared straight into her eyes. She smirked like she had already won. I said only 3 words, and I left. 2 weeks later, my son was banging on my door, completely desperate. My name is Wendell, and I am 70 years old. I spent my entire life building a legacy from nothing, only to watch my own flesh and blood try to tear it down for the sake of appearances. Before I tell you exactly how I dismantled their perfect illusion, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to remind ungrateful family members where their privilege came from. I sat at my worn oak kitchen table with a certified bank statement resting flat against the wood. The morning light cast long shadows over the numbers printed on the heavy paper. I did not blink as my eyes traced the lines of black ink. The joint account existed solely as a failsafe. I established it 15 years ago to ensure my son Jalen would never face the kind of financial ruin that could destroy a family overnight. It was meant for catastrophic medical emergencies or sudden operational disasters. I maintained a strict minimum balance, letting the interest compound quietly. I reviewed the statement again, tracing the balance column down to the final entry. A sum of $45,000 had been withdrawn exactly 3 days prior. My hands remained perfectly steady on the tabletop. I did not raise my voice to the empty room. I simply read the transaction code and the stark negative trajectory of the balance. The magnitude of the withdrawal indicated a deliberate and calculated extraction. I had survived decades of systemic redlining by knowing where every single cent of my capital resided at all times. Bank managers in the early days refused to look me in the eye, so I learned to read the numbers better than they did. A missing $45,000 was not an administrative error. It was a conscious, arrogant choice. I ran my thumb over the embossed seal of the bank logo. I had spent 40 years building a regional freight empire from a single rusty truck. I understood the mechanics of cash flow better than most accountants. This was a direct hemorrhage of my hard-earned assets. I picked up the paper and smoothed the crease. I needed to understand the exact nature of this breach before I addressed the symptom. I stood up from the oak table and walked into my home office to pull the digital records. I powered on my desktop and logged into the secure banking portal. The screen illuminated my face with a cold blue glow as I bypassed the dual authentication security measures. I accessed the detailed transaction history for the joint account and isolated the $45,000 withdrawal. The routing number led to a corporate account held by an elite architectural landscaping firm based in the wealthiest district of the city. They specialized in imported stone and custom aquatic features for high-end residential properties. Jalen had not experienced a sudden medical crisis. He had not suffered a catastrophic business failure. He had accessed the emergency safety net to build a luxury backyard terrace. The audacity of the transaction crystallized in my mind with absolute clarity. Jalen viewed the joint account not as a shield against ruin, but as a private slush fund to finance his social climbing. He treated capital like oxygen, assuming it would simply be there whenever he needed to breathe, regardless of who paid for it. I navigated to the landscaping firm's public portfolio. Their website boasted about hand-carved Italian marble and exotic botanical installations designed for outdoor entertaining. My son was using the money I bled for to impress people who did not care about him. He was trading my legacy for temporary validation. The betrayal was not just financial. It was a profound lack of respect for the labor that generated that wealth. Jalen believed he was entitled to the fruits of my suffering without ever planting a single seed. I closed the browser window and logged out of the portal. The cold blue light faded from the screen, leaving me in the quiet shadows of my office. I folded the bank statement meticulously and placed it into the breast pocket of my faded corduroy jacket. I picked up the keys to my 15-year-old sedan from the hallway hook. I walked out into the crisp morning air and slid into the driver's seat. The engine turned over with a reliable hum. I put the car in gear and drove toward the affluent suburbs. I remembered the freezing rain of October 1982. I remembered hauling heavy steel pallets by myself until my hands bled just to keep my first major freight contract from going to a larger white-owned competitor. The banks would not lend to me, so I funded the fuel and maintenance with sheer physical endurance and ruthless financial discipline. I knew the exact weight of a dollar because I had carried every single one on my back. I did not inherit a safety net. I built the safety net from scratch so my son could attend a private university without the suffocating burden of debt. I drove past the gated entrances of the sprawling estates that lined Jalen's neighborhood. He had never hauled a steel pallet in his life. He lived in a world where money appeared magically to smooth over his inadequacies. He possessed no concept of scarcity. The manicured lawns and towering oaks blurred past my window. My jaw tightened. It was time to remind him exactly whose labor built the foundation he was currently standing on. I parked my car on the street, refusing to pull into the oversized driveway. I wanted to walk the length of the property and observe the scope of his financial irresponsibility. I walked up the long sweeping driveway of Jalen's estate. A fleet of commercial vans occupied the space near the massive four-car garage. A crew of contractors in matching uniforms unloaded heavy crates of imported marble fountains from a flatbed truck. The sharp sound of power saws and shouting foremen filled the crisp morning air. The scale of the renovation was staggering, entirely funded by the money he stole from our joint account. I walked toward the grand front entrance. Peyton, Jalen's white wife, stood on the massive stone porch with her arms firmly crossed. She wore pristine designer athleisure and a scowl that deepened the moment she saw my faded corduroy jacket. She stepped directly in front of the heavy oak doors, physically blocking my path into my son's home. She did not offer a greeting. She pointed a manicured finger toward the side of the house. Peyton demanded I use the service entrance around back. She stated clearly that she could not risk me tracking grease or dirt from my old shoes onto her newly polished foyer tiles. She looked at me not as the man who funded her lavish lifestyle, but as a hired hand who had wandered too close to the main house. Her arrogance was palpable. I looked at the marble fountains being assembled on the lawn. I looked back at Peyton's smug expression. I adjusted the bank statement in my breast pocket. I did not argue. She assumed my silence was submission. She had absolutely no idea that I was simply calculating the precise moment to dismantle the entire illusion she called a life. I turned toward the service path, carrying the silent weight of my impending adjustment. I navigated the narrow flagstone path curving around the side of the sprawling house. The manicured hedges brushed against my faded corduroy jacket. I reached the heavy steel security door, designated for caterers and groundskeepers. I pressed my thumb to the biometric scanner I had personally paid to install 3 years prior. The deadbolt clicked open with a heavy metallic thud. I stepped into the cavernous kitchen. The room smelled of imported truffles and roasted garlic. The caterers had not yet arrived to prepare the evening meal. Sylvia sat alone at the massive quartzite island. Peyton's mother wore a tailored navy blouse that likely cost more than a standard mortgage payment. She held a long-stemmed crystal glass filled with a deep ruby vintage wine. She swirled the dark liquid with an practiced flick of her wrist. Sylvia did not smile when she saw me standing in the doorway. She stopped swirling her wine and lowered her glass to the pristine countertop. Her gaze traveled deliberately from the scuffed toes of my leather work boots up to the frayed collar of my jacket. She inspected me as if I were a stray dog that had somehow slipped past the estate security gates. She made no attempt to conceal her absolute disgust. The silence in the kitchen stretched out heavy and suffocating. I did not shift my weight or offer a polite greeting. I stood my ground under her scrutinizing stare. Sylvia took a slow sip of her wine. She placed the glass down and let out a sharp, theatrical sigh. She wanted me to feel the full weight of my supposed inferiority. She wanted me to shrink under the glare of a woman born into a legacy of inherited wealth. She failed to understand that a man who spent 40 years fighting for every inch of ground he stood on does not flinch under the gaze of a socialite. I simply watched her perform her practiced superiority. I knew the exact cost of the quartzite island she leaned against. I knew the routing numbers that funded every luxury in this room. Peyton strutted into the kitchen right on cue. She wore a sleek ivory evening dress and carried a silver clipboard filled with strict seating arrangements. She paused beside her mother and cast a brief, annoyed glance in my direction. Sylvia turned her attention to her daughter. Sylvia pitched her voice loudly enough to ensure every syllable struck my ears with deliberate force. She asked Peyton how a man of my particular background could ever manage to secure a down payment on a property in this exclusive zip code. Sylvia emphasized the word background with a sharp, venomous clarity. She heavily implied that a black man who hauled freight for a living had absolutely no business possessing real estate among the suburban elite. Peyton let out a high musical laugh that echoed off the vaulted ceiling. She placed a manicured hand on her mother's shoulder and dismissed the entire notion instantly. Peyton confidently declared that Jalen earned this estate entirely through his own unmatched corporate brilliance. She stated her husband was a modern financial genius who built their wealth from the ground up without a single handout. She spun a beautiful, complete fabrication for her mother to admire. Peyton fully believed the narrative Jalen had fed her since the day they met. She believed her husband was a self-made titan of industry. Sylvia nodded in profound agreement, raising her crystal wineglass to toast Jalen's fictitious achievements. They stood in the kitchen I purchased, drinking wine paid for by my labor, entirely convinced of their own supremacy. They openly mocked the very hands that placed the roof over their heads. I did not interrupt their shared delusion. I let them bask in their manufactured reality. The sheer audacity of their performance demanded a level of self-deception that bordered on clinical. I simply folded my hands together and listened closely. I did not utter a single word to correct the historical record. I stood perfectly still while my mind replayed the brutal events of a decade ago. I remembered sitting in a sterile bankruptcy lawyer's office. I remembered watching Jalen cry across the table as his first logistics venture collapsed under a mountain of severe mismanagement and hidden debts. I remembered signing the authorization to drain my entire personal retirement fund to satisfy his creditors and keep him out of federal prison. I sacrificed my security to buy his second chance. Jalen strode into the kitchen at that exact moment. He wore a custom-tailored charcoal suit that hugged his shoulders perfectly. He held a crystal tumbler of amber liquor in his right hand. He walked directly past me without making eye contact. He did not offer a handshake or a word of greeting to the father who saved him from ruin. Jalen looked at his expensive wristwatch and sighed heavily. He turned his head slightly in my direction, addressing me like a common-day laborer. He demanded I immediately go down to the guest basement. He commanded me to fix a leaking pipe under the secondary vanity before his elite guests started arriving. He issued the directive with a tone of absolute entitlement. He expected me to act as his personal handyman while his wife and mother-in-law insulted my legacy right to my face. The absolute lack of respect solidified my resolve. I did not argue or demand gratitude. I gave him a slow, deliberate nod. I turned away from the kitchen island and headed toward the basement door. Every step I took felt lighter than the last. I was a man executing a flawless, predetermined sequence of events. I descended the carpeted stairs into the finished basement. The air felt unnaturally cool and damp. I found the luxurious guest bathroom and knelt heavily on the polished tile floor. I opened the vanity cabinet and located the source of the persistent leak. A simple, loose PVC joint dripped water rhythmically onto the pristine baseboard. I pulled a small wrench from my coat pocket. I tightened the fitting with 3 sharp, calculated twists of my wrist. The dripping stopped instantly. I wiped a stray drop of water from my knuckle and closed the cabinet doors. I had completed my final task as the silent caretaker of Jalen's manufactured empire. I stood up and straightened my corduroy jacket. I walked slowly back up the basement stairs, letting my rough hand glide over the smooth wooden banister. The distant hum of classical music and polite conversation drifted down from the main floor. The first wave of dinner guests had clearly arrived while I was working in the dark. I reached the upper landing and paused just outside the grand dining room. I remained entirely hidden in the shadow of the hallway arch. The massive crystal chandelier cast a bright, warm glow over the long mahogany table. Sylvia held court at the head of the room. She pitched her voice over the soft music to command the attention of a group of wealthy corporate investors. I listened intently as Sylvia made a loud, deeply disparaging remark about my late wife. Sylvia proudly claimed that Corinne lacked the fundamental social grace to ever host a proper civilized event. She aggressively mocked my wife's humble origins to entertain a room full of arrogant strangers. The cruel words hung in the air like a toxic vapor. The absolute final line had just been crossed. I stepped out from the heavy shadows of the arched hallway and walked directly into the blinding glare of the dining room chandelier. The low hum of sophisticated chatter died instantly. A dozen wealthy investors turned their heads, their faces freezing in collective shock at the sudden intrusion of an old man in a stained corduroy jacket. I ignored the sea of judgment. My gaze locked entirely on Sylvia. She sat at the head of the long mahogany table, her crystal wineglass suspended halfway to her mouth. The arrogant smirk she wore just seconds prior began to waver under the weight of my silent stare. I walked slowly toward her, my heavy leather boots echoing against the pristine hardwood floor with the measured rhythm of a ticking clock. I stopped precisely 3 feet from her chair. I looked down at her with a cold, absolute certainty. I did not raise my voice. I spoke with a quiet, icy precision that commanded the entire room. I informed Sylvia that my late wife did not simply attend charity galas. She built them from the ground up. I listed the exact names of the institutions Corinne had breathed into existence while Sylvia was busy draining trust funds. I named the Oak Street Youth Literacy Initiative, a program Corinne funded by liquidating her own modest inheritance. I named the Southside Women's Shelter, an entire building she fought the city council for 3 years to zone properly. I named the Corinne Hughes Memorial Scholarship Fund, a trust that currently paid the full tuition of 40 underprivileged engineering students. I made sure every single syllable rang through the silent room like a gavel strike. I detailed how Corinne spent her weekends painting community center walls and auditing grant ledgers instead of sipping imported vintage wine on inherited granite countertops. I stated clearly that Corinne possessed more fundamental grace in a single calloused finger than Sylvia could ever hope to acquire in 10 lifetimes of country club memberships. The air in the dining room turned painfully thin. The investors stared at their empty plates, entirely unwilling to intervene or make eye contact. I held Sylvia's gaze until she physically shrank back into her expensive, upholstered chair. Sylvia's face flushed a deep, mottled crimson. The sudden public humiliation shattered her carefully cultivated veneer of aristocratic superiority. She grasped the stem of her wineglass so tightly her knuckles turned entirely white. She looked wildly around the table, searching the faces of her wealthy peers for a lifeline. Finding no salvation in their averted eyes, she immediately pivoted to her most reliable strategy. She played the victim with theatrical perfection. She gasped loudly and brought a trembling hand to her chest. She looked directly at Jalen, her eyes welling with forced, desperate tears. She whimpered a pathetic complaint about feeling violently attacked in her own family's home by an uninvited guest. Jalen reacted exactly as she had conditioned him to act. He stood up so fast his heavy wooden dining chair scraped violently against the polished floorboards. His face twisted into a mask of pure, unadulterated fury. The veins in his neck bulged against his tightly knotted silk tie. He held the expensive crystal tumbler in his right hand. The amber liquid sloshed wildly over the rim, staining the pristine white linen tablecloth. He glared at me with a hatred that completely erased 40 years of fatherhood. Jalen raised his arm and slammed his glass down onto the solid mahogany table with terrifying force. The thick crystal shattered instantly on impact. Jagged shards of expensive glass exploded across the polished wood, raining down onto the plates and silverware. A sharp gasp rippled through the seated guests. Amber liquor pooled and dripped heavily onto the expensive rug below. Jalen did not care about the mess. He did not care about the terrified silence of his corporate investors. He cared only about defending the people who continuously validated his fragile ego. He stared at me through the wreckage, his chest heaving with heavy, ragged breaths. Jalen raised a violently shaking finger and pointed it directly at my chest. He completely ignored the blood trickling from a small cut on his palm. His voice cracked with a hysterical rage that echoed off the vaulted ceiling. He commanded me to look at his mother-in-law. He demanded I issue an immediate groveling apology for insulting her character in front of his important associates. He screamed that I had fundamentally ruined a critical evening of networking with my archaic presence and bitter attitude. He laid out a brutal ultimatum with absolute finality. I was to beg Sylvia for forgiveness on the spot, or I was to turn around and walk out the front doors forever. I slowly shifted my gaze away from my furious son and looked across the room. Peyton leaned against the dining room archway. She wore a look of supreme satisfaction. She slowly crossed her arms over her pristine ivory evening dress. A dark, victorious smirk played across her lips. She watched the confrontation with the eager anticipation of a spectator watching a gladiator match. Peyton firmly believed she had finally won the long war. She believed this engineered public humiliation had successfully severed the very last thread of my influence over their lives. She assumed Jalen's explosive defense of her mother proved that his loyalties had permanently shifted to her family's wealthy lineage. She thought I was simply a defeated old man, completely stripped of my dignity and discarded by my own flesh and blood. She thought she had completely conquered the board. She failed to comprehend that I had not even begun to play my hand. I stood amid the shattered crystal and the spilled liquor. I looked at the shaking finger of the son I had sacrificed my entire youth to elevate. I looked at the smug, triumphant sneer of the woman who viewed my existence as a stain on her foyer tiles. In that quiet, frozen moment, a profound and absolute silence settled over my mind. The heavy, suffocating burden of parental obligation evaporated. The final fraying tether of my protective instinct snapped clean. I felt no sorrow. I felt no heartbreak. I felt only the cold, mechanical clarity of a man surveying a condemned building right before the demolition charges detonate. I looked directly into Peyton's triumphant eyes. Her smirk faltered slightly under the weight of my dead stare. I turned my head slowly and locked eyes with Jalen. He stood there panting, waiting for my submission or my retreat. He expected a tearful plea. He expected an angry tirade. I gave him neither. I simply delivered the final verdict of his financial execution. I spoke 3 words with a quiet, devastating finality. Assume the mortgage. I turned my back on the silent room. I did not look back at the broken glass or the shocked faces of the investors. I walked steadily toward the grand front entrance, my boots striking the imported marble with heavy purpose. Jalen broke the silence with a shrill, hysterical scream. He shouted furiously at my retreating back, declaring loudly that the estate belonged entirely to him. I pushed open the massive oak doors and stepped out into the cold night air, leaving him trapped inside his beautiful hollow lie. The cold night air hit my face the moment I stepped off the grand portico of my son's house. I could still hear the faint echo of Jalen shouting my name into the void of his foyer. I ignored the sound entirely. I walked down the expansive driveway, passing the imported marble fountains and the fleet of commercial contractor vans. My boots crunched against the loose gravel near the curb, where my 15-year-old sedan waited in the shadows. I unlocked the heavy metal door and slid into the driver's seat. I reached into the breast pocket of my corduroy jacket and pulled out the folded bank statement. The crisp paper caught the dim amber glow of the street lamp above. The negative $45,000 entry stared back at me, a permanent record of absolute disrespect. I sat in the profound silence of the vehicle and allowed the reality of the situation to settle into my bones. I retrieved my cellular phone and dialed a number I knew intimately well. Bradley was not just my corporate attorney. He was the chief architect of my legal defenses, a man who had spent 2 decades shielding my freight empire from predatory competitors. He answered on the second ring, despite the late hour. I did not offer a polite greeting. I simply instructed him to cancel his morning appointments and prepare the master files for the Suburban Estate Trust. I told him I required a total structural review of the lease agreements by dawn. Bradley recognized the icy cadence of my voice immediately. He confirmed the directive and disconnected the line. The morning sun crested over the downtown skyline as I stepped into the glass elevator of Bradley's high-rise building. I wore my tailored charcoal suit, discarding the faded corduroy jacket, along with the remnants of my patience. The receptionist escorted me directly into the primary conference room. Bradley stood waiting by the floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the financial district. I had hauled steel through those very streets 40 years ago, fighting for every single mile. Bradley turned away from the glass and gestured toward the massive conference table. He looked entirely prepared for a brutal legal offensive. Bradley unclasped his thick leather briefcase and withdrew a stack of heavy legal folders. He spread the master property deeds across the reflective surface of the glass table in a precise, organized array. The documents bore the official seals of the county registry and the intricate watermark of my private holding company. Jalen genuinely believed he was a master of real estate. He strutted through country clubs boasting about his property portfolio and his brilliant investment strategies. He allowed his wife to insult the man who funded her reality. The master deeds sitting on the table proved his entire existence was a carefully constructed legal fiction. Jalen owned absolutely nothing. I looked down at the highlighted sections of the primary deed. I owned the private holding company entirely. That holding company owned the sprawling suburban estate, outright purchased entirely in cash, the day Jalen married Peyton. The financial architecture was designed specifically to protect the asset from Jalen's established history of profound fiscal irresponsibility. I had executed a strict ironclad lease agreement between the holding company and Jalen. The contract legally permitted him to reside on the property for the sum of exactly $1 a month. It was a fail-safe measure meant to ensure he would never face homelessness even when his inevitable business failures materialized. Jalen had completely forgotten the nature of this arrangement. He confused my quiet generosity with his own fundamental capability. He assumed the paperwork was merely a tax loophole rather than a rigid boundary. He treated the estate as his personal kingdom, leveraging the appearance of immense wealth to secure invitations to elite social circles. Peyton paraded through the manicured gardens, firmly convinced she was the mistress of a grand manor. They lived inside a magnificent bubble of my design, completely unaware that I held the needle capable of bursting it at any given moment. I tapped my index finger against the glass table. I instructed Bradley to initiate the immediate termination of the residential lease agreement. I cited the specific clause buried on the 4th page of the master contract. The clause strictly prohibited any unauthorized structural modifications to the property or the surrounding grounds. Jalen's decision to raid my joint account to finance a luxury backyard terrace and import marble fountains directly violated the foundational terms of his tenancy. He had altered the physical landscape of the estate without submitting a single formal request to the holding company. His arrogance provided the exact legal mechanism required to dismantle his sanctuary. Bradley nodded slowly, his eyes scanning the dense legal text. He confirmed that the unauthorized landscaping construction constituted a catastrophic breach of the core agreement. The contract stipulated that any unapproved alteration immediately nullified the $1 a month arrangement, converting the tenancy into a month-to-month lease at standard market rates, or triggering an immediate forfeiture of the premises at the owner's discretion. I did not want market rates. I wanted the property completely vacated. I wanted Jalen to feel the cold, hard reality of the concrete ground he had spent his entire life avoiding. Bradley opened his sleek laptop and positioned his hands over the keyboard. The quiet clicking of the keys echoed sharply in the cavernous conference room as he drafted the formal notice of termination. He worked with the ruthless efficiency I required from all my associates. The legal language was cold, absolute, and devoid of any familial sentiment. It severed the financial umbilical cord with surgical precision. I watched the cursor move across the bright screen, finalizing the document that would force my son to finally face the true cost of his profound disrespect. The rhythmic clicking of the keyboard stopped abruptly. Bradley stared intently at his secondary monitor. He leaned closer to the screen, his brow furrowing in deep concentration. The swift, confident demeanor of my lead attorney vanished entirely, replaced by a rigid, tense silence. He dragged his mouse across a separate legal database, cross-referencing a newly uploaded county file. Bradley let out a slow, measured breath. He turned the large monitor around so the screen directly faced my side of the glass table. He informed me that we had a significantly larger problem than unauthorized landscaping. Bradley pointed a silver pen at a dense digital document displayed on the monitor. He revealed a massive anomaly recently filed in the county registry. 2 weeks prior, Peyton and Jalen had initiated a high-risk commercial transaction. Peyton's boutique design firm was actively failing, hemorrhaging capital at an unsustainable rate. To save her sinking vanity project, they had applied for a $2 million commercial loan. The bank required substantial physical collateral to underwrite a risk of that immense magnitude. Jalen and Peyton had legally pledged the sprawling suburban estate as the primary collateral for the massive debt. The commercial loan application required the explicit notarized authorization of the primary deed holder. Jalen did not hold the primary deed. I held the primary deed through my private holding company. Bradley reached into his briefcase and withdrew a sealed evidence folder. He slid a certified photocopy of the final bank application across the smooth glass desk. I looked down at the signature line resting at the bottom of the heavy financial contract. It was not my son's signature. It contained a flawless, meticulously executed forgery of my own signature. 2 days elapsed in a cold and absolute silence. I did not contact Jalen regarding the forged commercial loan document. I allowed the silence to stretch because silence makes guilty men restless. I needed him to make the next move so I could measure the exact depth of his desperation. On the third morning, I drove to the independent hardware store on the south side of town. I needed a specific brass fitting for a utility sink in my garage. I walked down the narrow plumbing aisle surrounded by the metallic scent of copper pipes and industrial solvent. I held a small threaded valve in my palm, examining the grooves. A shadow fell across the concrete floor, blocking the harsh fluorescent light from the main aisle. I looked up from the brass fitting. Jalen stood directly at the end of the aisle. He positioned his body to completely obstruct my path to the exit. He wore a casual cashmere sweater and a bright manicured smile that did not reach his eyes. He acted as if the shattered crystal, the spilled liquor, and the venomous screaming match in his dining room had never occurred. He greeted me with a loud, theatrical cheerfulness that instantly set my nerves on edge. He clapped his 2 hands together and loudly asked how my morning was going, projecting the image of a devoted and caring son checking in on his aging father. The performance was entirely nauseating to witness in the harsh store lighting. I did not return his greeting. I did not ask him why he was tracking my movements. I simply placed the brass fitting into my canvas shopping basket and waited for him to reveal his actual agenda. I knew my son possessed neither the patience nor the mental discipline to maintain casual small talk with me without an ulterior motive driving him forward. He took a step closer, invading my personal space with that practiced corporate charm. He reached inside his tailored designer coat and withdrew a thick manila folder. He held it out toward me like a very heavy, desperate peace offering. I did not raise my hand to voluntarily accept the heavy document. Jalen stepped forward and physically pressed the folder against my chest, forcing me to grip the cardboard edges to prevent it from falling onto the floor. I looked down at the label. It bore the crest of an expensive private medical facility located on the affluent north side of the city. I flipped open the cover. The pages inside contained a comprehensive array of pre-filled psychological evaluation forms and neurological assessment waivers. My name and personal information were already typed neatly into all the primary demographic boxes. Only my signature was missing. Jalen lowered his voice into a soft tone of manufactured sympathy. He stated that he and Peyton had spent the last 2 days feeling deeply concerned about my cognitive health. He claimed they had noticed severe, highly alarming lapses in my memory during our recent interactions. He explicitly referenced the brutal argument in his dining room 2 nights prior, suggesting my anger was a direct symptom of early-stage dementia rather than a justified response to their monumental disrespect. He spun a sick, twisted narrative of profound worry, masking his treacherous intent with the language of familial care. He tapped a manicured finger against the top page of the thick medical packet. He insisted I attend a mandatory neurological assessment at this specific private clinic by the end of the week. He claimed he had already paid the exorbitant consultation fees out of his own pocket to ensure I received the absolute best medical attention available. He framed the mandatory medical appointment not as a choice but as an unavoidable obligation. He stared at me with a cold, unblinking intensity, simply waiting for me to succumb to his psychological manipulation and sign away my autonomy. I did not need an advanced medical degree to diagnose the true pathology of this sudden encounter. I connected the disparate pieces of his vicious strategy in a mere fraction of a second. The forged commercial loan application currently sitting on Bradley's glass desk was a massive federal crime waiting to detonate. Peyton and Jalen knew their highly fraudulent transaction would inevitably trigger a catastrophic legal response once I discovered the missing funds. They desperately needed a massive preemptive strike to permanently discredit my authority and completely shield themselves from the devastating consequences of severe wire fraud. A clinical diagnosis of severe cognitive decline provided them with the ultimate defensive weapon. If they successfully procured a certified medical document declaring me legally incompetent, my accurate accusations regarding the forged signature would be instantly dismissed by the authorities as the paranoid delusions of a rapidly failing mind. A formal court-mandated guardianship order would effectively erase my legal identity. The state would forcibly strip away my rights and hand the total reins of my entire estate directly to my next of kin. My son was not trying to save my life. He was actively attempting to execute a hostile corporate takeover through the probate court. If Jalen secured full medical conservatorship, the fraudulent $2 million loan against the suburban estate would be instantly validated retroactively. Peyton's failing boutique firm would receive the massive illicit capital injection she so desperately craved. Furthermore, Jalen would gain absolute unrestricted access to the freight company's primary liquid asset reserves. He fully intended to drain the vital operational accounts I spent 40 years accumulating to simply fund his endless pursuit of suburban aristocracy. He planned to bury me alive in a luxury medical facility while he systematically dismantled my hard-earned legacy brick by brick. I looked at the heavy medical folder resting in my calloused hands. I released my grip completely. The thick manila envelope plummeted toward the floor, striking the cold concrete with a sharp, resounding slap. The pre-filled evaluation forms spilled across the plumbing aisle, scattering wildly over the dusty ground. Jalen stared down at the scattered papers in absolute, unadulterated shock. When he lifted his gaze back to meet mine, the polished corporate facade had vanished entirely. His features contorted into an ugly, unrecognizable snarl. The thin veneer of the caring son burned away completely, revealing the desperate, cornered predator underneath. Jalen stepped aggressively into my personal space, his voice dropping into a low, venomous hiss. He explicitly warned me that my stubborn defiance would only accelerate his rigid timeline. He threatened to contact Adult Protective Services by the very end of the day. He claimed he possessed a sworn legal affidavit from a nearby neighbor, stating, "I had left a gas stove burning overnight, nearly setting my entire neighborhood ablaze." He fabricated a terrifying scenario of severe residential negligence. He stated he had photographic evidence of my supposed dangerous incompetence, ready to submit to a presiding judge. The sheer brazenness of the malicious lie brought a cold, sharp clarity to my mind. They were not simply waiting for me to naturally slip up. Peyton and Jalen were actively manufacturing fake physical evidence to construct a flawless legal narrative. They fully intended to force an involuntary psychiatric hold before I could alert the federal banks about the forged loan application. I stepped around my son, leaving his scattered medical trap lying on the concrete floor. The time for quiet observation had officially concluded. I needed to move significantly faster than the vicious lies they were currently building against me. I walked out of the heavy hardware store doors and stepped into the harsh afternoon sunlight. The encounter with Jalen solidified the exact timeline I was currently operating against. My son and his wife were no longer simply greedy opportunists manipulating my finances from a distance. They were active, desperate threats manufacturing a psychological cage designed to neutralize my legal authority. I drove my 15-year-old sedan back toward my neighborhood, my mind actively working through the precise logistical requirements of my impending defense. I needed absolute undeniable proof of their physical trespassing to complement the financial forgery sitting on Bradley's desk. I pulled into my driveway and immediately dialed the direct number of Marcus Vance. Marcus was a former military intelligence officer who had managed the primary security contracts for my freight loading bays during the most turbulent expansion years of my company. He understood the absolute necessity of discretion and speed. He answered on the first ring. I gave him a concise, detailed overview of my immediate requirements. I needed top-tier internal surveillance capable of capturing high-definition audio and video without alerting the subjects to its presence. Marcus arrived at my house within the hour in an unmarked gray van. He brought a team of 2 silent, highly efficient technicians. They moved through my modest home with military precision. Within 4 hours, they had completely wired the interior of my residence. They embedded microscopic motion-activated camera lenses directly into the wooden crown molding of the living room, the hallway, and my primary office. They wired the high-fidelity microphones behind the metal covers of the air conditioning vents. Marcus synchronized the entire closed-circuit system to a heavily encrypted application on my cellular phone. He handed me the master control tablet and assured me the feed was completely invisible to standard electronic detection methods. I paid him generously in cash from my personal safe. I locked the front door behind his crew. My physical perimeter was now completely secured and actively monitored. I walked down the hall and entered the quiet solitude of my home office to begin the digital excavation. I sat in my heavy leather desk chair and powered on my primary administrative terminal. The machine hummed quietly as it connected to the remote servers housed at my corporate headquarters. I bypassed the superficial security protocols Jalen had implemented to conceal his daily activities. He possessed a foundational misunderstanding of digital architecture, falsely assuming a few altered administrative permissions could block the original architect of the entire network. I initiated a brutal, comprehensive forensic audit of the freight company's internal servers. I deployed my own proprietary tracking software to analyze every single capital transfer executed over the past 24 months. The algorithmic search flagged dozens of critical inconsistencies almost immediately. I watched the numbers populate the bright screen, painting a devastating portrait of systematic corporate theft. Jalen had been purposefully inflating our operational invoices and siphoning the excess capital directly into a secondary financial stream. I traced the bleeding funds through a labyrinth of false vendor payments and phantom logistics contracts. He had utilized the company's massive daily cash flow to conceal the continuous extraction of wealth. I isolated the final destination of the embezzled capital. Jalen was actively funneling massive amounts of operational liquid assets directly into a recently established shell corporation. The scale of the embezzlement was truly staggering, revealing a man who viewed his father's life work solely as an endless personal treasury. The sheer volume of the stolen capital explained exactly how he managed to project such a flawless illusion of independent wealth to his suburban peers. I sat alone in the quiet darkness of my office, watching the relentless scrolling of the corrupted ledgers. He was actively bleeding my legacy dry to fund his fragile, aristocratic facade. I needed to document the precise magnitude of the damage before I permanently severed his financial lifeline. I opened the corporate registry database to identify the primary officers of the illicit shell corporation. The digital search query loaded instantly across my primary monitor. The entity was not registered under Jalen's name. The illicit shell corporation was legally registered entirely under Sylvia's name. My son was aggressively draining the financial lifeblood of my logistics empire to directly fund his mother-in-law's lavish lifestyle. He had actively stolen the capital generated by the sweat of my loyal drivers and the dedication of my mechanics to purchase Sylvia's imported vintage wine and designer clothing. The discovery illuminated the true depth of his profound betrayal. Jalen had completely abandoned the foundational legacy of his own family to purchase the superficial approval of a woman who despised everything we represented. He mortgaged my 40 years of brutal labor to buy his way into a world that would never truly accept him. I felt a cold, calculated calm settle completely over my mind. The time for familial leniency was permanently finished. I pulled a heavily encrypted external hard drive from the locked drawer of my desk. I connected the drive to my secure administrative terminal. I methodically downloaded every single routing number, every fabricated vendor invoice, and every damning ledger discrepancy. I secured the comprehensive digital paper trail detailing the massive corporate theft. I duplicated the complete file directory to ensure I possessed multiple untraceable copies of the evidence. I safely ejected the encrypted drive and placed it securely into my coat pocket, alongside the forged commercial loan documents. I had successfully assembled the total legal ammunition required to completely destroy their fabricated reality. I fully closed the auditing software and shut down the primary terminal. The bright monitor faded to black, plunging the room back into heavy and absolutely silent darkness. I sat back in my chair. My cellular phone suddenly vibrated aggressively against the solid, polished wood of my desk. The high-definition screen flashed a brilliant pulsing red. The newly installed motion sensor at my front door had been triggered. I picked up the device and opened the secure surveillance application. The live feed from the microscopic camera embedded in the porch molding materialized instantly. The high-resolution lens captured Sylvia and Peyton standing directly on my front welcome mat. Peyton glanced nervously over her shoulder, scanning the quiet suburban street for any approaching vehicles. Sylvia clutched her expensive designer handbag tightly against her chest, her face pinched in an expression of intense, hurried anticipation. I watched through the glowing screen as Peyton reached into the pocket of her tailored jacket. She withdrew a jagged brass key. She had secretly copied the master key to my home without my knowledge or consent. She slid the copied key directly into the heavy brass deadbolt. I listened to the synchronized audio feed broadcast clearly through my phone speakers. Peyton whispered urgently to her mother, confirming the coast was clear. She explicitly stated to her mother that today was the exact anniversary of Corinne's passing. Peyton arrogantly assured Sylvia that I would be occupied at the city cemetery for at least another 3 hours, leaving the house completely unprotected. They had perfectly weaponized my grief to execute their calculated invasion. They assumed I was standing over my wife's grave entirely vulnerable while they infiltrated my private sanctuary to hunt for the original estate trust documents. I did not move from my chair. I simply watched the live feed as Peyton turned the copied key. The heavy deadbolt retracted with a loud metallic click. The heavy front oak door slowly groaned completely open. My trap was officially set and fully ready. I did not travel to the cemetery. Peyton had fundamentally miscalculated my grief, assuming the anniversary of Corinne's passing would reduce me to a weeping, incapacitated widower kneeling over a marble headstone. She believed sorrow made a man weak and predictable. She failed to understand that Corinne's memory was the very forge that hardened my resolve. I sat perfectly still in the high-backed leather armchair, positioned in the deepest shadows of my living room. The thick blackout curtains were drawn tight, blocking the late afternoon sun and plunging the space into absolute darkness. I regulated my breathing, slowing my heart rate to a steady, quiet rhythm. The heavy oak front door creaked open, breaking the profound silence of the house. A sliver of bright daylight sliced across the foyer tiles before the door was quickly pulled shut, sealing the intruders inside my sanctuary. The sharp click of the deadbolt locking echoed through the quiet hallway. Two distinct sets of footsteps moved across the hardwood floor. Sylvia's heavy designer heels clicked with an arrogant, impatient cadence, while Peyton's lighter steps hurried to keep pace. They did not bother to turn on the overhead lights, relying instead on the ambient glow filtering through the hallway transoms. They moved with the hurried, careless energy of thieves who firmly believed they were entirely alone. I watched their silhouettes cross the threshold into the living room, completely oblivious to my presence less than 10 feet away. Peyton whispered urgently to her mother, her voice tight with frantic anticipation. She directed Sylvia toward my home office down the adjacent hall. Peyton explicitly stated they needed to locate the physical master trust documents before I returned from my supposed mourning. She complained about Jalen's inability to secure the digital files, insisting that destroying the original notarized paperwork was the only way to guarantee the estate transferred cleanly into her control. Sylvia hushed her daughter sharply, warning her to keep her voice down just in case the neighbors were listening through the open ventilation drafts. They moved like vultures, eager to pick the bones of a legacy they did not earn. They advanced exactly 2 steps into the center of the living room. I reached my right hand over the armrest and found the cold metal switch of the vintage brass floor lamp beside my chair. I turned the heavy dial with a loud, definitive click. The sudden burst of warm, incandescent light flooded the room, illuminating their startled faces with brutal clarity. Sylvia let out a sharp, genuine gasp that caught painfully in her throat. She physically recoiled, her hands flying upward in pure shock. The expensive designer handbag slipped from her manicured fingers and hit the hardwood floor with a heavy, unceremonious thud, spilling cosmetics and silver keychains across the polished planks. Peyton froze entirely, her eyes wide and completely terrified. Her mouth opened, but her vocal cords failed to produce a single sound. They stared at me sitting calmly in the leather armchair, their minds struggling to process the catastrophic failure of their flawless infiltration plan. The air in the room instantly turned thick and suffocating. I did not stand up. I did not raise my voice or display a single ounce of the furious anger boiling beneath my skin. I simply folded my hands in my lap and observed them with the detached clinical scrutiny of a judge presiding over an open and shut trial. I broke the heavy silence with a quiet, measured tone that demanded absolute attention. I informed them directly that they had just committed a textbook felony. I laid out the precise legal parameters of breaking and entering a private residence with the explicit intent to commit corporate espionage and document theft. I reminded them that possessing a stolen key did not negate the profound illegality of their uninvited presence inside my home. I stated the facts without emotion, delivering the devastating reality of their situation with icy precision. The initial shock evaporated from Peyton's face rapidly, replaced by a dark, arrogant sneer. She refused to shrink under the weight of her own blatant criminality. She straightened her posture and stepped aggressively toward my armchair, her heels clicking loudly against the floor. Peyton let out a sharp, mocking laugh that held absolutely no humor. She crossed her arms tightly over her chest and looked down at me with an expression of supreme manufactured superiority. She firmly believed the rules of consequence simply did not apply to a woman of her particular social standing. She told me my legal definitions were completely irrelevant to the reality of the situation. Peyton leaned forward, her voice dropping into a low, venomous threat. She explicitly stated that Jalen had already taken the ultimate initiative. She proudly announced that he had officially filed the medical competency paperwork that very morning. Peyton did not stop at the mere existence of the legal filing. Her arrogance demanded she display the full extent of their engineered corruption. She boasted that the petition was not submitted to a random clerk, but routed directly to a specific family court judge. She stated the judge's name with absolute triumph, ensuring I understood the gravity of her revelation. Peyton detailed how this particular magistrate owed Sylvia a massive, outstanding political favor stemming from a highly sensitive zoning dispute a decade ago. She laid out the mechanics of their conspiracy with terrifying clarity. Peyton explicitly admitted that the medical evaluation was entirely fabricated, the evidence was manufactured, and the legal outcome was already predetermined by backroom favors. She smiled down at me, her eyes gleaming with dark satisfaction. She proudly confessed that they had completely rigged the judicial system to ensure I would be permanently stripped of my rights and my assets before the week concluded. I listened to her entire meticulous confession without moving a single muscle. I let the absolute silence stretch out for 3 long seconds after she finished speaking. Then I slowly uncrossed my hands and raised my right index finger. I pointed directly toward the intricate wooden crown molding running along the ceiling above the fireplace mantel. I instructed Peyton to look very closely at the small microscopic red light blinking steadily in the shadows of the woodwork. I watched her gaze track my finger upward. Her eyes locked onto the tiny rhythmic pulse of the high-definition surveillance lens embedded in the wall. I informed Peyton that every single syllable she just uttered had been captured with crystal-clear audio fidelity. I stated that her explicit admission of political bribery, judicial corruption, and malicious document forgery was not simply recorded on a local hard drive. I told her the live feed was currently and permanently uploaded to a heavily encrypted cloud server monitored by my corporate security team. The color drained out of Peyton's face with astonishing speed. Her arrogant smirk vanished, replaced by a hollow, sickening realization. She staggered backward, bumping into her mother. Sylvia's complexion turned a ghostly ashen white as she looked up at the blinking red light. They had walked into my home believing they were the apex predators executing a flawless ambush. They suddenly realized they had stepped directly into an inescapable, digitally fortified steel trap. The political favors and the forged signatures were entirely useless against hard, unalterable audio-visual evidence of federal conspiracy. I lowered my hand and placed it flat on the armrest. I did not offer them a chance to bargain or explain. I stared at the 2 terrified women standing in the center of my living room. I issued a single absolute command. I ordered them to get out of my house immediately. Sylvia flinched as if I had struck her physically. The heavy designer handbag remained forgotten on the floorboards, its expensive contents scattered wildly across the polished oak. She turned on her heel and practically sprinted toward the open front door, her carefully curated composure entirely shattered. Peyton lingered for exactly 1 second, her eyes darting frantically from the blinking red lens of the security camera back to my stoic face. The cold reality of the digital trap finally overrode her manufactured arrogance. She spun around and chased after her mother, her expensive heels slipping clumsily on the marble foyer tiles. I listened to the rapid panicked clicking of their footwear retreating down the driveway. Car doors slammed violently in the distance, followed by the high-pitched squeal of tires tearing away from the curb. The heavy front door remained ajar, letting in the cool, damp evening breeze. I stood from my armchair, walked deliberately across the room, and locked the deadbolt. I retrieved my cellular phone from my pocket and dialed Bradley's secure line. He answered immediately, the ambient background noise of his high-rise office completely muted. I informed him that the physical infiltration of the property had occurred precisely as anticipated, and that the surveillance network had successfully captured the explicit legal confession. I instructed Bradley to initiate the immediate financial shutdown of my son's entire operational framework. I ordered the total liquidation of Jalen's secondary holding accounts and the absolute freezing of all corporate credit lines tied to the freight logistics network. I dictated that every single financial artery connecting my life's work to his fraudulent shell corporation be severed without a single warning notification. I wanted the stolen capital drained back into the primary corporate trust before Jalen even realized the tap had run dry. Bradley confirmed the directives with his usual ruthless efficiency. He stated he would execute the zero-hour protocol directly through the private banking liaisons. I detailed the exact routing numbers associated with Sylvia's illicit holding company, ensuring the structural firewall blocked any further extraction. The financial guillotine was primed and ready to drop. Bradley executed the protocol with absolute terrifying silence. Within the span of 45 minutes, the massive financial infrastructure supporting Jalen's aristocratic delusion ceased to function. The commercial banks initiated the hard locks on all associated accounts, severing access to the corporate reserves instantaneously. The algorithms neutralized the platinum credit lines, rendering the heavy metal cards entirely useless. Jalen received no automated text message alerts. He received no courtesy calls from his dedicated wealth managers. Bradley utilized specialized fraud prevention statutes to mandate a strict communication blackout during the asset reclamation process. The commercial institutions froze the ledgers quietly, trapping my son's stolen capital behind an impenetrable digital wall. The financial lifeline that funded his luxury vehicles, his tailored suits, and his imported marble fountains was completely severed, while he remained blissfully unaware. I walked into my dimly lit kitchen and filled the glass carafe of the coffee maker with fresh water. I measured the dark, coarse grounds with methodical precision, finding comfort in the simple mechanical routine. The machine hissed and sputtered, filling the quiet house with the rich, bitter aroma of dark roast. I poured the black liquid into a ceramic mug and carried it back into the living room. I sat back down in the leather armchair, surrounded by the deep shadows of the evening. I took a slow, deliberate sip of the burning coffee. The house felt unnaturally still, possessing the kind of heavy, pressurized silence that precedes a massive atmospheric shift. I sat in the darkness and waited for the inevitable impact. I knew the exact moment the manufactured reality they had built upon my back would violently collapse. I was a man perfectly prepared to weather the incoming storm. The foundation of their arrogance had been quietly demolished, leaving them standing on empty air. The narrative shifted exactly 24 hours later. Peyton stood beneath the massive glittering crystal chandeliers of the grand ballroom inside the city's most exclusive downtown hotel. She wore a custom-tailored emerald silk gown that cost more than a standard freight driver's annual salary. She was hosting the inaugural charity gala for her failing boutique design firm. The entire extravagant event was a desperate, highly calculated performance designed solely to elevate her fragile social status among the urban elite. She paraded through the sea of wealthy investors and local politicians, offering practiced smiles and hollow pleasantries. She clutched a flute of imported champagne, firmly believing she had successfully cemented her position at the absolute pinnacle of local high society. Peyton viewed the massive ballroom not as a venue for actual philanthropy, but as a glittering monument to her own manufactured success. She had hired the most expensive catering company in the tri-state area. She had ordered rare, out-of-season floral arrangements imported directly from South America to decorate the dozens of circular tables. A classical string quartet played softly in the corner, masking the sound of clinking crystal and superficial networking. She floated through the crowd, completely intoxicated by the illusion of her own supreme wealth and untouchable prestige. She remained entirely unaware that the financial foundation supporting the entire spectacle had been surgically amputated the previous night. She was a woman dancing on the deck of a sinking ship, fully convinced the vessel was unsinkable. The evening progressed flawlessly, feeding her monumental ego with every passing hour. She basked in the admiring glances of her peers, entirely oblivious to the catastrophic reality waiting for her just beyond the ballroom doors. The gala slowly wound down as the wealthy attendees began filtering toward the valet stand. Peyton strutted confidently into the private administrative office located just off the main kitchen corridors. She approached the senior catering director to settle the final staggering invoice for the evening's elaborate production. The director, a stern man in a dark suit, slid a heavy leather folder across the polished mahogany desk. The final bill totaled exactly $80,000, a massive sum covering the imported caviar, the premium open bar, and the exorbitant venue rental fees. Peyton did not even bother to glance at the itemized breakdown. She offered the director a haughty, dismissive smile and confidently withdrew the sleek black platinum corporate card from her designer clutch. She tossed the heavy metal card onto the desk with an arrogant flick of her wrist, expecting the transaction to process with the usual unquestioned ease. The director inserted the platinum card into the secure commercial terminal. The machine processed the data for 3 long, agonizing seconds before letting out a sharp negative beep. The digital screen flashed a bright red error code indicating a hard decline due to a frozen account. The director frowned, removed the card, and processed it a second time. The machine rejected the transaction instantly. He looked up at Peyton, his professional demeanor hardening into rigid suspicion. He slid the card back across the desk and quietly informed her that the primary bank had explicitly blocked the funds. Peyton's arrogant smile shattered entirely. She snatched the card and frantically demanded he run it again, her voice rising in sudden hysterical panic. The general manager of the hotel stepped into the office, drawn by the escalating commotion. He looked at the declined terminal, then looked directly at Peyton. He stated with icy, unwavering authority that if an alternative, valid payment method was not produced within the next 10 minutes, he would immediately contact the local authorities and have her arrested for grand theft of corporate services. Peyton stared at the blinking red light on the credit card terminal. The hotel manager stood with his arms crossed over his chest, projecting an aura of absolute impatience. Peyton forced a high, brittle laugh that sounded entirely unnatural in the small administrative office. She quickly blamed an overzealous fraud protection algorithm, claiming her bank often froze the corporate card during large, uncharacteristic evening transactions. She reached into her designer clutch with trembling fingers and retrieved her personal titanium card. This account held the joint liquid assets she shared directly with Jalen. She handed the heavy metal card to the catering director, her emerald silk gown suddenly feeling stifling and heavy against her skin. The director swiped the titanium card through the terminal. The machine communicated with the banking server for 2 agonizing seconds before emitting another sharp, definitive beep. The screen flashed the exact same red error code. The transaction was completely declined. The hotel manager stepped forward, entirely abandoning his polite hospitality facade. He spoke in a loud, firm voice that carried directly through the open office door and out into the adjacent marble corridor. Several wealthy attendees, including a prominent city councilman and his wife, paused their conversation to look directly at Peyton. The manager reiterated his 10-minute ultimatum, stating clearly that he would not allow his staff to be defrauded by socialites playing games with empty bank accounts. The public humiliation struck Peyton with the force of a physical blow. The carefully constructed illusion of her infinite wealth shattered in front of the exact people she desperately wanted to impress. Peyton snatched both cards from the director's hand. Her face flushed a deep mottled red, completely ruining her flawless makeup. She muttered a frantic excuse about needing to contact her private wealth manager immediately to clear the administrative hold. She turned and practically sprinted out of the office, fleeing the scrutinizing stares of her elite guests. She shoved past a startled waiter carrying a tray of empty champagne flutes, ignoring the crashing sound of breaking glass behind her. Peyton pushed her way into the women's restroom and locked herself inside the furthest marble-lined stall. She leaned her forehead against the cold door, gasping for air as a full-blown panic attack seized her lungs. Inside the quiet isolation of the bathroom stall, Peyton pulled her cellular phone from her clutch. Her manicured hands shook so violently, she nearly dropped the device into the porcelain sink. She bypassed her contacts and dialed Jalen's private number, her breath coming in short, ragged gasps. He answered on the 4th ring, his voice thick with annoyance at the late-hour interruption. Peyton did not bother with pleasantries. She whispered frantically into the receiver, her voice cracking with pure desperation. She demanded to know why every single financial pipeline was suddenly severed. She rapidly explained the catastrophic situation unfolding in the hotel administrative office. She informed him that the hotel manager was preparing to dial the police in exactly 8 minutes to report an $80,000 theft of services. Miles away from the downtown gala, Jalen sat comfortably in his lavishly decorated home office. He leaned back in a heavy leather chair purchased entirely with embezzled corporate funds. He rolled his eyes at his wife's frantic tone, completely dismissing her panic as a dramatic overreaction to a minor administrative banking glitch. He confidently assured Peyton that he would clear the automated fraud block in a matter of seconds. Jalen placed his phone on speaker and pulled his sleek laptop closer. He navigated directly to their primary wealth management portal, projecting absolute arrogance. He typed his secure login credentials with rapid practiced keystrokes. Jalen fully expected to see the massive inflated numbers he had grown so accustomed to viewing. He planned to simply execute an instant wire transfer to the hotel's merchant account and silence the impudent manager. He pressed the enter key to access the central financial dashboard. He leaned closer to the bright screen, waiting for the secure server to authenticate his identity and grant him total access to his stolen kingdom. The banking dashboard loaded with agonizing slowness. Jalen stared at the high-definition monitor. The primary checking account did not display the expected six-figure sum. The digital ledger showed a stark, undeniable zero balance. Jalen blinked rapidly, his mind completely failing to process the visual information. He moved his mouse and clicked aggressively on the Joint Savings tab. The screen refreshed, displaying another absolute zero. He navigated frantically toward the secondary investment portfolios and the offshore routing hubs he had utilized to fund Sylvia's illicit shell corporation. Every single digital vault was entirely locked, displaying bright red warning banners across the top of the interface. A formal, unyielding legal notification rested at the very center of the portal. Jalen clicked the secure message, his heart beginning to pound, a heavy, erratic rhythm against his ribs. The notification contained the official crest of his father's private holding company. The digital document stated clearly that a total asset freeze and complete capital seizure had been legally executed. The bank had fully complied with a massive corporate clawback directive initiated by the primary deed holder. The holding company had legally reclaimed all available liquid assets to cover the immense liability of massive unauthorized operational withdrawals and a highly fraudulent commercial loan application. The financial fortress Jalen had built upon a foundation of deceit instantly evaporated into thin air. The money he had meticulously siphoned from the freight company's operational reserves was completely gone. The capital he had stolen to finance Peyton's failing boutique firm, his luxury vehicles, and his mother-in-law's extravagant lifestyle had been forcefully ripped back by the very man he sought to destroy. Jalen sat frozen in his expensive leather chair. He stared at the glowing red zeros illuminating the dark office. The full, crushing weight of his father's parting words finally struck him. The quiet command to assume the mortgage was not a bitter insult. It was a precise declaration of absolute financial annihilation. Jalen realized with terrifying clarity that his father had executed the ultimate threat. Wendell had not only discovered the brutal extent of the corporate embezzlement, but he had also uncovered the flawless forgery on the $2 million commercial loan application. Jalen reached out and ended the phone call with Peyton cutting off her sobbing pleas for help without uttering a single word of comfort. He could not save his wife from public humiliation because his own survival was now severely compromised. He stood up so fast, his chair violently struck the mahogany bookcase behind him. Jalen sprinted out of his home office, his chest heaving with sheer, unadulterated panic. He grabbed his keys from the kitchen island and ran out the side door toward the garage. He threw himself into the driver's seat of his luxury sports car and slammed his foot onto the accelerator. He tore out of the manicured driveway, the expensive tires screaming against the smooth suburban asphalt. Jalen sped recklessly into the cold, dark night, heading directly toward the freight company's downtown headquarters. His mind clung to a singular, desperate, and entirely doomed strategy. Jalen firmly believed he could physically bypass the external commercial bank locks by accessing the internal corporate servers directly from the main office. He planned to break into the administrative hub, manually override the primary security protocols, and wire the remaining operational funds to an untraceable offshore account. He needed to execute the illicit transfer before the morning processing cycle made the financial freeze absolutely permanent. He gripped the leather steering wheel until his knuckles turned white, driving like a man fleeing a scheduled execution. He fully intended to burn his father's legacy to the ground, to secure his own escape, completely unaware that his every move was already anticipated and heavily monitored. Jalen's luxury sports car careened into the private executive parking garage beneath the towering glass facade of the freight company headquarters. The heavy rubber tires shrieked in protest as he slammed the vehicle diagonally across two reserved spaces. He threw the driver's side door open, before the engine even settled into a steady idle. He did not bother to secure the vehicle. His mind focused entirely on the massive internal servers housed on the 42nd floor. He sprinted across the polished concrete floor, his custom leather loafers echoing loudly in the cavernous garage. He reached the private elevator bay reserved exclusively for senior directors and pulled his silver executive keycard from his breast pocket. He slapped the magnetic strip against the security reader with frantic, trembling hands. The small LED indicator above the scanner flashed a harsh, brilliant red. The heavy steel elevator doors remained completely motionless. A low, negative buzz rejected his access credential. Jalen swore loudly under his breath, attributing the failure to a simple administrative server lag caused by the late hour. He spun around and sprinted toward the secondary access stairwell leading directly into the main public lobby. He pushed through the heavy fire doors and stumbled into the expansive marble-lined atrium. The massive corporate logo of the freight empire my blood and sweat had built loomed high above the reception desk. Jalen completely ignored the sheer scale of the legacy surrounding him. He viewed this entire building only as a mechanical host designed solely to pump liquid capital directly into his personal checking accounts. He hurried toward the towering glass turnstiles guarding the primary elevator banks. He pressed his executive badge against the primary optical scanner, fully expecting the thick, tempered glass barriers to smoothly retract. The security terminal emitted a sharp, piercing alarm. The LED panel mounted on the sleek metallic turnstile shifted instantly from a welcoming green to an impenetrable glowing red. The reinforced glass barriers locked rigidly into place with a heavy mechanical thud. Jalen slammed his body against the transparent gates, fully expecting them to yield to his physical momentum. The thick barriers did not budge a single inch. The blunt impact knocked the wind from his lungs and sent him stumbling backward onto the polished marble floor. He stared wildly at the flashing red security terminal, his panic multiplying exponentially. He swiped the silver badge a second time, then a third, dragging the plastic violently across the optical reader. The machine responded with the same flat, unforgiving rejection. The digital system had systematically purged his identity from the corporate registry. Two massive figures detached themselves from the deep shadows surrounding the dimly lit reception desk. They wore heavy tactical gear layered over dark corporate security uniforms. I had personally authorized their presence earlier in the afternoon. They belonged to the elite private security firm managed by Marcus Vance, possessing absolute loyalty to the foundational architect of the company rather than the parasitic heir. They moved with silent, synchronized military precision, their heavy boots making no sound on the marble floor. They stepped directly in front of the locked glass turnstiles, forming an impenetrable human barricade between Jalen and the corporate elevators. They crossed their thick arms over their chests and stared down at my son with cold, professional indifference. Jalen straightened his rumpled cashmere sweater, attempting to project an aura of unassailable executive authority. He aggressively commanded the men to step aside, loudly declaring his status as the primary operational director of the entire logistics network. The security contractors did not flinch or acknowledge his desperate posturing. The head guard, a towering man with a severe, scarred jawline, reached into his tactical vest. He withdrew a crisp, white legal envelope bearing the official embossed seal of the corporate board of directors. He extended his arm and pressed the heavy envelope directly against Jalen's chest, forcing my son to take physical possession of the document. Jalen looked down at the pristine paper, his manicured fingers trembling violently. He tore open the seal and unfolded the thick legal parchment inside. His eyes darted frantically across the bold, capitalized text dominating the header of the page. The document was not a simple reprimand or a temporary administrative suspension. It was a formal, irrevocable declaration of immediate termination. The text detailed a unanimous vote executed by the senior board of directors just 2 hours prior, acting on irrefutable evidence of severe financial malfeasance. The corporate charter I had painstakingly drafted decades ago contained a specific fail-safe clause designed to instantly neutralize any executive officer found guilty of deliberate internal theft. Jalen had never bothered to read the foundational bylaws of the empire he claimed to manage. The letter explicitly outlined his total removal from all corporate operations, effectively stripping him of his title, his salary, and his entire professional identity in a single devastating stroke. The second paragraph of the termination notice delivered the absolute killing blow. The legal text formally notified Jalen that he was permanently banned from setting foot on any commercial property owned or operated by the holding company. The injunction explicitly stated this immediate physical banishment was necessary pending a comprehensive federal fraud investigation. The corporate legal team had already submitted the encrypted hard drive containing his fabricated vendor invoices and illicit shell corporation transfers directly to the appropriate federal financial regulatory agencies. He was no longer simply an unemployed executive. He was an active target of a massive federal criminal probe. The staggering reality of a looming prison sentence finally crushed his fragile, arrogant reality. Jalen completely lost his mind. The polished, sophisticated demeanor he utilized to charm wealthy country club investors evaporated into thin air. His face twisted into a mask of pure, primal rage and unadulterated terror. He crumpled the heavy termination letter in his shaking fist and hurled it directly at the head guard's face. He let out a deafening feral scream that echoed violently across the empty marble atrium. He lunged forward, throwing his entire body weight against the tactical security contractors. The guards did not even break a sweat. They easily deflected his clumsy assault, shoving him backward with a calculated bruising force that sent him crashing hard onto his hands and knees. Jalen scrambled back to his feet, ignoring the sharp pain radiating up his arms. He charged the reinforced glass turnstiles instead. He pounded his bare fists against the thick, tempered barriers with absolute chaotic desperation. He shrieked my name into the empty lobby, demanding access to the servers, demanding his money, demanding the lifestyle he believed was his birthright. His knuckles split open against the unforgiving glass, leaving small, dark smears of blood on the pristine surface. He hammered the barrier relentlessly, acting exactly like a spoiled, entitled child, throwing a violent tantrum because his favorite toy had been snatched away. He completely failed to understand that his infantile rage meant absolutely nothing against the cold, unyielding architecture of a fortified corporate security system. The sharp, piercing ringtone of Jalen's cellular phone abruptly cut through his hysterical screaming. The sudden electronic noise startled him, causing him to freeze with his bleeding fists pressed flat against the cold glass. He reached into his pocket with violently shaking hands and pulled out the sleek device. The bright screen illuminated his pale, terrified face in the dim lobby lighting. The caller identification displayed Sylvia's name. Jalen swiped the screen to answer desperately, hoping his mother-in-law had successfully managed to clear the banking block with her own extensive political connections. He brought the phone to his ear, panting heavily, as he waited for a single piece of positive news. Sylvia did not offer financial salvation. Her voice exploded through the small speaker in a shrill, completely terrified shriek that forced Jalen to pull the phone away from his ear. She screamed that a professional process server had just arrived at the front gates of the suburban estate. She hysterically reported that the server was not alone. The man was actively flanked by a full-armed police escort holding an official court-mandated eviction order. The local authorities were actively securing the perimeter of the property, entirely bypassing the private neighborhood security detail. Sylvia shrieked that the officers were currently ordering Peyton to vacate the premises, immediately citing a catastrophic breach of lease and a massive fraud investigation. Jalen stood completely paralyzed in the center of the vast corporate atrium. He listened to the chaotic sounds of police radios and his wife's distant sobbing protests echoing through Sylvia's phone. The absolute magnitude of the engineered destruction finally crystallized in his mind. I had not simply cut off his allowance. I had synchronized a simultaneous total annihilation of his entire existence. The corporate empire was locked. The bank accounts were drained. The suburban estate was actively being seized by law enforcement. The criminal investigators were already analyzing the forged loan documents. Jalen stared blankly at the blood smeared across his knuckles. He finally realized the foundation of his entire life was crumbling into dust, all at exactly the same time, leaving him with absolutely nowhere left to hide. The timeline reversed exactly 60 minutes before Jalen shattered his knuckles against the reinforced glass of my corporate lobby. The quiet, manicured streets of his exclusive suburban neighborhood remained entirely undisturbed by the financial executions occurring downtown. A plain, unmarked white sedan turned onto the sweeping circular driveway of the sprawling estate Jalen claimed as his own. The vehicle bypassed the decorative brick pillars and parked directly in front of the massive double oak doors. A professional process server stepped out into the cool evening air. He wore a nondescript gray suit and carried a thick, sealed manila envelope. He was a veteran of the legal system, completely immune to the wealthy posturing and aggressive intimidation tactics typically deployed by residents of this particular zip code. He walked up the stamped concrete steps with absolute practiced calm. The server pressed the illuminated brass button of the doorbell. The deep, resonant chime echoed through the cavernous foyer of the house. He waited precisely 30 seconds before pressing the button a second time, standing squarely in the center of the porch to ensure his presence was fully captured by the overhead security cameras. Heavy, hurried footsteps approached from the interior hallway. The lock clicked, and the heavy oak door swung inward. Sylvia stood in the threshold, gripping a crystal wine glass. She wore a silk lounging robe, her expression twisting into immediate deep annoyance at the uninvited interruption. She glared at the man in the gray suit, her eyes scanning his modest vehicle parked carelessly in her pristine driveway. Sylvia demanded to know how he had bypassed the neighborhood security gate and ordered him to state his business before she summoned the local authorities. She operated under the arrogant assumption that the physical boundaries of the estate rendered her completely untouchable. She firmly believed the sheer scale of the house intimidated ordinary citizens into subservience. The server did not flinch or offer an apology for the intrusion. He simply confirmed her identity, stating her full legal name with crisp, robotic efficiency. Sylvia offered a sharp, impatient nod of confirmation, entirely unaware that she was officially closing the legal trap. The server instantly extended his arm and pressed the sealed manila envelope firmly against her chest. He announced that she had been legally served, turned on his heel, and began walking back toward his white sedan. Sylvia dropped her wine glass. The crystal shattered across the porch tiles, splashing dark red liquid against the white columns. She snatched the envelope, tearing the heavy paper open with frantic, trembling fingers. She pulled out the formal court-approved documents. The bold black lettering at the top of the page clearly designated a 30-day eviction notice. The legal text explicitly mandated the immediate vacation of the premises, citing a catastrophic breach of lease agreements and a total revocation of residential privileges by the primary property holding company. Sylvia stared at the eviction mandate, her mind violently rejecting the reality of the printed words. The sheer audacity of the document shattered her carefully maintained facade of aristocratic invulnerability. She let out a guttural shriek of pure, unadulterated rage. She gripped the thick legal parchment in both hands and ripped it violently down the center. She tore the eviction notice into dozens of jagged pieces and hurled the shredded paper into the evening breeze, watching the fragments scatter across the manicured lawn. Sylvia snatched her cellular phone from her robe pocket. She bypassed the private neighborhood patrol and dialed emergency services directly. The dispatch operator answered the call. Sylvia began shrieking hysterically into the receiver, her voice echoing wildly across the quiet suburban street. She claimed a dangerous lunatic was actively harassing her family and trespassing on her private estate. She demanded an immediate armed police response, completely convinced that local law enforcement existed solely to enforce her personal comfort and punish anyone who dared to challenge her manufactured authority. A local police cruiser arrived at the estate within 7 minutes, its blue and red emergency lights flashing silently against the dark facades of the neighboring mansions. 2 uniformed officers stepped out of the vehicle and approached the porch. Sylvia immediately launched into a frantic, tearful performance pointing toward the street and demanding they hunt down the man in the gray suit. She accused the server of criminal trespassing and aggressive intimidation. The commanding officer, a seasoned veteran with a calm, analytical demeanor, did not immediately fall for her hysterical theatrics. He instructed her to step back and lower her voice. The officer crouched down and began gathering the shredded pieces of heavy parchment scattered across the damp grass. He pieced the jagged fragments together on the hood of his cruiser, illuminating the text with his heavy tactical flashlight. He scanned the legal phrasing and immediately identified the official verifiable digital court stamp printed clearly at the bottom of the mandate. He walked back toward the porch, his posture shifting from defensive to strictly bureaucratic. He held up the pieced-together document and informed Sylvia that no crime had been committed by the departed individual. He stated with absolute unyielding authority that the eviction notice was an entirely legal court-sanctioned directive. Sylvia gasped vehemently, denying the possibility, shrieking that her son-in-law owned the massive estate outright. The commanding officer shook his head, pointing a thick finger at the bold print detailing the property deed. He informed her that Jalen did not own a single brick of the residence. The estate was legally owned and operated entirely by a corporate holding company. He advised her to cease wasting police resources and begin packing her belongings, warning her that resisting a lawful eviction order would result in immediate physical removal and criminal trespassing charges. The flashing lights of the police cruiser pulled away from the curb just as a yellow city taxi turned into the sweeping driveway. The cab came to a sudden halt behind Sylvia. The rear door swung open and Peyton stepped out into the cold night air. She had fled the disastrous charity gala in absolute humiliation, her emerald silk gown dragging against the concrete. She bypassed her mother entirely, her face pale and her eyes wide with lingering panic from the declined platinum cards. Peyton marched directly toward the front door, desperate for the familiar safety of her luxurious home. She stopped dead in her tracks. A secondary pristine copy of the 30-day eviction notice was securely taped directly to the heavy oak door at eye level. Peyton reached out with shaking fingers and peeled the document from the wood. She read the legal mandate word for word, her eyes tracing the corporate holding company's title and the explicit declaration of non-ownership regarding Jalen. The cold, brutal truth finally penetrated her aristocratic delusion. Jalen had never owned the sprawling estate. The luxury, the prestige, and the infinite wealth she believed she had married into was a complete structural fabrication. He was merely a glorified tenant, living entirely on borrowed corporate credit that had just been permanently revoked. Peyton crushed the eviction notice in her fist, her shock instantly transmuting into a cold, furious survival instinct. She did not scream or throw a tantrum like her mother. She realized the sinking ship had officially broken in half, and she refused to go down with the wreckage. She shoved past Sylvia without speaking a single word. Peyton stormed into the cavernous foyer and marched directly up the grand staircase to the master suite, her mind completely focused on packing her expensive designer luggage before the bank seized everything she claimed to own. Jalen pulled his sports car into the circular driveway, his engine cutting out just moments after Peyton had stormed inside. He walked through the towering double oak doors, his knuckles still raw and bruised from pounding against the reinforced glass of the corporate lobby. He found Peyton standing in the center of the master suite, frantically throwing expensive designer clothing into a matching set of leather luggage. She did not bother to look up when he crossed the threshold. Peyton immediately launched into a blistering, venomous tirade that completely stripped away the final fragile remnants of their manufactured aristocratic romance. She screamed that she had married a titan of municipal industry, not a fraudulent tenant living entirely on his father's stolen corporate credit. She hurled a heavy crystal perfume bottle across the room, watching it shatter violently against the wall mere inches from Jalen's face. She explicitly stated she was leaving him to salvage whatever social standing she had left in the city, taking the only remaining physical cash from their hidden wall safe. Jalen did not move a single muscle to stop her departure. The profound humiliation of his absolute financial castration left him completely hollowed out. He turned around and walked straight back down the sweeping staircase, leaving his fractured marriage dissolving in the master suite. He drove his sports car to a seedy commercial district on the industrial edge of the city, parking beneath the flickering neon sign of a 24-hour predatory lending office. Jalen possessed no liquid capital to retain immediate legal counsel, forcing him to leverage the only asset he technically held free and clear. He handed over the pink slip to his vintage imported motorcycle, signing a brutal short-term title loan with a staggering interest rate that would bankrupt a normal citizen within a month. He carried the thick envelope of high-interest cash directly to the private residence of Arthur Vance, a notoriously vicious defense attorney who specialized in aggressive corporate litigation and possessed absolutely no moral compass. Jalen slammed the cash onto the lawyer's glass coffee table, demanding an immediate catastrophic legal counteroffensive against his father. Arthur Vance counted the stack of predatory cash with deliberate, methodical slowness. He listened to Jalen's frantic recounting of the frozen corporate accounts, the locked executive turnstiles, and the looming 30-day eviction notice currently taped to the estate door. The attorney did not care about the truth of the massive embezzlement or the forged commercial loan documents. He only cared about identifying a viable legal wedge to forcefully pry the holding company's assets back open. Vance formulated a ruthless, scorched-earth legal strategy designed to completely bypass the standard slow-moving civil litigation process. He immediately drafted a comprehensive emergency injunction aimed directly at the heart of my financial and legal authority. The legal filing did not attempt to defend Jalen's fraudulent vendor invoices or the illicit shell corporation transfers. Instead, Vance constructed a completely fabricated narrative portraying me as a severe danger to the foundational stability of the family empire. He explicitly weaponized my recent widowhood, twisting my silent, solitary grieving process into a calculated medical diagnosis of severe advanced cognitive decline. The injunction demanded the immediate cessation of all eviction proceedings against Sylvia and Jalen, arguing that the property seizure was the chaotic result of a deteriorating mind rather than a legitimate corporate audit. Vance typed the malicious legal fiction with rapid practiced keystrokes, formally petitioning the court to temporarily reinstate Jalen's executive privileges to prevent the supposedly inevitable collapse of the freight logistics network. He built a weapon out of pure slander designed to legally decapitate me before the federal fraud investigators could fully process the damning evidence currently sitting on the corporate servers. He assured Jalen that a sudden, vicious attack on my mental competency was the only reliable method to stall the total liquidation of their stolen lifestyle. The emergency filing explicitly asserted that my recent financial actions were the direct result of acute paranoia and profound mental instability. Vance meticulously documented my total withdrawal from the country club social scene and my refusal to engage with the corporate board over the past 6 months, framing these deliberate choices as textbook symptoms of severe isolation and dementia. The document claimed I had violently hallucinated a massive corporate conspiracy leading directly to the erratic, irrational freezing of all operational capital and the cruel eviction of my own family. It was a masterpiece of character assassination, carefully engineered to force the judicial system into immediate aggressive intervention. Vance bypassed the standard bureaucratic delays by filing the injunction through a specialized emergency legal channel reserved for imminent corporate catastrophes. He successfully routed the paperwork to a presiding duty judge late in the evening. The magistrate reviewed the dire claims of cognitive collapse and the potential bankruptcy of a major municipal employer. Unwilling to risk the total destruction of the freight company without a formal hearing, the judge signed a temporary administrative order. The court mandated a mandatory high-stakes emergency mediation hearing, scheduled for exactly 8 o'clock the very next morning. The ruling temporarily paused the execution of the eviction notice and demanded my physical presence in the judge's private chambers to defend my own sanity. Jalen left the attorney's office with a smug, triumphant smile returning to his face. He assumed I would crumble under the harsh public scrutiny of a judicial interrogation. He banked his entire survival on the false premise that I was an exhausted, grieving old man who would simply surrender rather than fight a vicious battle in open court. My encrypted cellular phone chimed softly in the silent, darkened living room. The digital summons materialized on the high-definition screen delivered directly via priority electronic courier. I read the vicious medical allegations and the mandatory mediation order without a single spike in my heart rate. The emergency injunction was not a surprise. It was the exact desperate maneuver I had anticipated the moment I severed his financial lifeline. I locked the screen and placed the device face down on the heavy mahogany desk. I walked down the quiet hallway and entered my master bedroom. I did not attempt to sleep. I opened the cedar closet and carefully removed my best-tailored charcoal suit from its protective canvas garment bag. I laid the heavy wool trousers and the crisp white Oxford shirt across the mattress, preparing my armor for the final confrontation. I retrieved my vintage leather polishing kit and sat on the edge of the bed. I applied the dark wax to my black Oxfords, working the polish into the leather with slow, methodical, rhythmic circles until the surface gleamed with a perfect, mirror-like finish. I found a deep, grounding peace in the quiet precision of the physical task. When the shoes were immaculate, I walked back into my home office and dialed Bradley's direct line. He answered instantly, entirely alert, despite the late hour. I informed him of the emergency mediation hearing and confirmed that the final, incontrovertible evidence of Jalen's massive federal loan forgery was fully prepared for legal presentation. Bradley assured me the trap was completely set and ready to spring. I hung up the phone and looked out the window into the pitch-black suburban night. I was absolutely ready to finish the game. I drove into the subterranean parking structure of the municipal courthouse just as the morning sun breached the city skyline. I stepped out of my sedan, my charcoal suit draped perfectly across my shoulders, carrying the heavy weight of 40 years of unforgiving corporate warfare. I walked through the metal detectors and crossed the sprawling marble atrium of the Judicial Center. My polished Oxfords struck the stone floor with a steady rhythmic cadence that echoed with absolute unshakable authority. I did not possess the frantic, desperate energy of an elderly man fighting for his independence. I moved with the cold, calculated precision of a chief executive arriving to finalize a hostile takeover. I entered the private mediation chambers on the 4th floor precisely 10 minutes before the scheduled 8 o'clock hearing. The room was sterile, paneled in dark oak, and dominated by a long, polished conference table. I took my seat on the right side of the room, folding my hands neatly in front of me. The heavy wooden doors swung open 2 minutes later. Jalen walked into the room accompanied by his high-priced defense attorney, Arthur Vance. My son looked entirely wretched, completely stripped of his usual manufactured aristocratic polish. His custom-tailored suit looked disheveled and dark, exhausted shadows circled his eyes. The brutal reality of his frozen bank accounts and the looming federal fraud investigation had clearly stolen his ability to sleep. Jalen took his seat directly across the heavy oak table from me. He immediately dropped his gaze, focusing intensely on the blank legal pad resting in front of him. He lacked the fundamental courage to look his own father in the eye. He knew he was sitting in the presence of the man whose legacy he had actively attempted to butcher. I observed his trembling hands and his shallow, rapid breathing. Jalen was operating entirely on blind panic, clinging desperately to Vance's fabricated legal strategy as his final lifeline. He firmly believed this sudden, vicious attack on my cognitive faculties would temporarily blind the judge to the massive financial crimes he had committed. He desperately needed the magistrate to reinstate his corporate access so he could funnel the remaining liquid capital offshore before the federal authorities raided his home. I simply watched him sweat under the harsh fluorescent lights. I did not speak a single word to him. The absolute silence in the room stretched out heavy and suffocating, serving as a brutal reminder that I held complete control over the battlefield he had foolishly chosen to enter. The heavy chamber doors opened a final time to admit the assigned magistrate, Judge Harrison, followed closely by Peyton and Sylvia. The two women were directed to sit in the small spectator gallery positioned against the back wall. Peyton glared at me with absolute, unadulterated venom. Her expression was a volatile mixture of profound humiliation and frantic rage. She had spent the entire night packing designer luggage in a house she now knew she did not own, her social standing completely obliterated by a single declined credit card transaction. Sylvia sat rigidly beside her daughter, clutching her expensive handbag. She looked equally furious, entirely unwilling to accept that her luxurious suburban sanctuary was currently locked behind an irrevocable corporate eviction mandate. They stared at me with pure malice, silently demanding my immediate destruction. Judge Harrison took his seat at the head of the long table, opened the thick case file, and officially called the emergency mediation to order. Arthur Vance stood up immediately, projecting an aura of aggressive, practiced confidence. He buttoned his suit jacket and launched directly into his carefully rehearsed character assassination. Vance spoke with smooth, persuasive eloquence, completely bypassing the standard legal pleasantries. He asserted that this hearing was a matter of dire life-or-death urgency regarding the stability of a major municipal logistics empire. Vance approached the judge's bench and confidently slid a thick stack of fabricated medical documents across the polished wood. He declared that these files represented irrefutable proof of a rapid, catastrophic mental decline. Vance detailed my recent withdrawal from high society social events, twisting my quiet mourning period into a diagnosis of severe isolating paranoia. He pointed directly at me, his voice echoing loudly in the sterile room, and accused me of suffering from aggressive delusions. He boldly claimed that my decision to freeze the corporate accounts and initiate an eviction against my own family was the tragic, undeniable symptom of a deteriorating mind entirely detached from reality. Arthur Vance amplified the theatricality of his presentation, pacing the length of the conference table to ensure every person in the room felt the gravity of his fabricated claims. He explicitly stated that my erratic financial behavior was actively destroying a legacy I had spent 4 decades building. Vance warned the judge that without immediate judicial intervention, the entire freight company would plunge into irreversible bankruptcy within 48 hours. He framed Jalen not as a desperate, thieving son, but as a loyal, heroic executive fighting to save his father's mind and his employees' livelihoods from complete ruin. Vance expertly wove a narrative that completely inverted reality, relying on the sheer audacity of the lie to overwhelm the court's natural skepticism. The attorney formally requested an immediate emergency guardianship order, transferring total control of my medical and financial decisions directly to Jalen. He did not stop at simply requesting the reinstatement of corporate access. Vance pushed for absolute permanent domination. He demanded that the court immediately strip me of all legal autonomy and mandate my placement into a secure, locked, institutional care facility. He argued that I represented a profound danger to my own estate and required 24-hour medical supervision to prevent further catastrophic self-sabotage. Peyton and Sylvia nodded vigorously from the gallery, playing the roles of deeply concerned family members mourning the tragic loss of my sanity. Jalen kept his head down, desperately trying to maintain the facade of a heartbroken son forced into taking drastic measures. Vance concluded his vicious monologue by slamming his hands flat against the table, demanding the judge sign the guardianship order right there in the chambers. The attorney stood tall, entirely convinced he had successfully bullied the court into executing a swift, unquestioned legal decapitation. I did not react to the staggering cruelty of their demands. I sat perfectly still, observing the flawless execution of their final, desperate gamble. Bradley sat in the heavy wooden chair directly to my right, his posture relaxed and entirely unbothered by Vance's aggressive grandstanding. My corporate attorney did not possess a shred of the frantic, sweating desperation radiating from the opposing side of the table. Bradley waited for the echoes of Vance's demands to fade completely into the heavy oak paneling. He looked across the table at Jalen and offered a slow, predatory smile that contained absolutely zero warmth. It was the smile of an apex predator watching its prey willingly step into a reinforced steel cage. Bradley stood up with deliberate, agonizing slowness, adjusting his tie before addressing the judge. He completely ignored Arthur Vance. Bradley calmly stated that the defense fundamentally agreed that a severe criminal emergency was actively threatening the corporate estate, but clarified that the threat did not originate from my cognitive faculties. He reached down and opened the brass clasps of his vintage leather briefcase. Bradley pulled out a thick, heavily bound legal folder and a small metallic external hard drive. He placed the item squarely on the polished table with a definitive heavy thud that made Jalen physically flinch. Bradley informed the court that the folder contained the undisputed certified digital ledgers detailing an excess of $2 million in fraudulent corporate embezzlement actively executed over the past 24 months by the man seeking guardianship. He stated that the metallic drive held high-definition audio-visual evidence of felony breaking and entering coupled with explicit verbal confessions of judicial bribery and document forgery. Bradley slid the evidence directly toward the magistrate, his predatory smile widening. The trap I had meticulously built over the past week finally snapped completely shut, trapping my son entirely within the cold, unforgiving jaws of federal law. Bradley unclasped the heavy brass hinges of his leather folder. He withdrew a stack of pristine watermarked documents, each bearing the official raised seal of the state's premier medical research institute. He did not hand them to Arthur Vance. He handed the original stack directly to Judge Harrison, then distributed certified copies to the opposing counsel and my son. I watched Jalen stare blankly at the thick medical dossier, his eyes frantically scanning the dense clinical terminology. Bradley broke the suffocating silence, his voice projecting absolute, unshakable authority across the polished oak table. He informed the court that these documents constituted a comprehensive, independent neurological evaluation. I had not waited for their fabricated injunction to dictate the terms of my medical competency. Weeks prior, anticipating this exact desperate legal maneuver, I had voluntarily subjected myself to 3 grueling days of exhaustive cognitive and psychological testing under the direct supervision of the chief of neurology. Bradley directed the magistrate's attention to the final page of the assessment. He read the concluding diagnostic paragraph aloud for the official record. The chief neurologist declared with absolute medical certainty that I possessed a pristine cognitive baseline demonstrating exceptional executive function, perfect memory retention, and acute analytical reasoning capabilities. The medical expert explicitly stated there was absolutely zero evidence of dementia, paranoia, or any deteriorating mental condition. The fabricated narrative of a confused, isolating old man was instantly incinerated by empirical, undeniable scientific fact. Arthur Vance stared down at the watermarked copy in his hands. The aggressive, predatory confidence he had projected just moments ago began to rapidly dissolve. He had built his entire emergency injunction on a foundation of medical fiction, and Bradley had just presented the irrefutable truth. Judge Harrison reviewed the signatures and the institutional seals with a dark, deepening scowl. He looked up from the dossier and fixed Arthur Vance with a stare of profound judicial warning. Presenting knowingly fraudulent medical claims to a sitting judge in an emergency hearing bordered on criminal contempt. Jalen sank lower into his leather chair, the physical reality of his catastrophic miscalculation finally taking hold. He had gambled his entire freedom on the assumption that I was too weak to defend myself. I sat perfectly still, my posture rigid and commanding, projecting the exact imposing presence that had built an empire from nothing. The medical attack was neutralized, but Bradley was only beginning the systematic dismantling of their lives. Bradley did not allow the opposition a single second to recover from the medical revelation. He seamlessly transitioned to the next phase of the execution. He reached for the small metallic external hard drive resting on the table and connected it directly to the large multimedia monitor mounted on the chamber wall. The screen flickered to life, displaying the secure interface of my home surveillance network. Bradley tapped his keyboard, initiating the playback of the encrypted video file. The high-definition infrared security footage illuminated the dark chamber, showing the clear, undeniable silhouettes of Peyton and Sylvia infiltrating my private residence. The crisp audio feed captured the loud metallic click of their copied key turning the heavy deadbolt. The color drained entirely from Peyton's face in the spectator gallery. She gasped a sharp, ragged sound that echoed loudly in the quiet room. Sylvia clamped a hand over her mouth, her eyes wide with sudden terror. The video played flawlessly, tracking their movements into the center of my living room. The brilliant burst of the vintage floor lamp illuminated their shocked expressions on the screen. The entire mediation chamber fell into a deadly silence as the digital recording continued. Peyton's arrogant recorded voice filled the room, echoing off the mahogany panels with brutal clarity. She openly boasted about Jalen filing the competency paperwork detailing their malicious intent to strip my assets. The true devastation arrived seconds later. The recorded audio broadcast Peyton's explicit detailed admission of judicial corruption. She named the specific family court judge, boldly detailing the outstanding political favors and the guaranteed manufactured outcome of their legal filings. Judge Harrison's face turned a dangerous shade of crimson. Hearing a fellow magistrate implicated in a brazen documented bribery scheme transformed this civil dispute into a severe criminal conspiracy. He glared at the two women cowering in the gallery, his judicial neutrality replaced by raw, unadulterated outrage. Peyton shrank back into her seat, physically trembling under the devastating weight of her own recorded arrogance. The trap was closing rapidly, and the digital evidence was absolutely inescapable. The video concluded, leaving the final frame of Peyton's terrified face frozen on the large monitor. The silence in the judge's chambers was absolute, heavy with the undeniable reality of multiple federal felonies. Bradley did not pause to allow the devastation to settle. He opened the final compartment of his leather briefcase and pulled out a secondary, thicker legal binder. He slid the heavy file across the table directly to Arthur Vance. Bradley announced that this final dossier contained the comprehensive findings of an independent forensic audit, explicitly focusing on the $2 million commercial loan application filed under the freight company's corporate charter. He stated with icy precision that the signature on the primary authorization line was a masterful but entirely fraudulent forgery. Bradley detailed the exact methodology of the financial crime. He explained that Jalen possessed a fundamental, fatal misunderstanding of network architecture. Jalen had falsely assumed that utilizing an external banking portal would mask his digital footprint. He failed to comprehend that the proprietary tracking software I had personally coded decades ago monitored every single data packet interacting with our corporate servers. Bradley presented the forensic cyber analysis, laying out the exact electronic paper trail. The documentation explicitly connected the fraudulent loan application and the subsequent unauthorized capital transfers directly to the unique IP address assigned to Jalen's home office router. The evidence was not circumstantial. It was a mathematical certainty, binding Jalen directly to a massive act of wire fraud and corporate embezzlement. He had stolen millions from the very foundation of his family's legacy, entirely unaware that the system was meticulously logging his every keystroke. Jalen stared at the forensic documentation, his breathing shallow and rapid. He looked like a man standing on the trapdoor of a gallows, listening to the executioner pull the final lever. The illusion of his impenetrable intelligence was completely shattered. He was not a sophisticated corporate raider. He was a careless, arrogant thief who had left a massive, glowing trail of digital evidence leading straight back to his own front door. Arthur Vance stared down at the mountain of irrefutable evidence resting on the table before him. He scrutinized the medical certifications, the video transcripts, and the forensic digital audit. The high-priced attorney turned a sickly pale shade of gray. He instantly recognized the catastrophic peril of his current legal position. He had formally submitted a fabricated emergency injunction based on fraudulent claims, actively representing a client demonstrably guilty of federal wire fraud, corporate embezzlement, and judicial bribery. Proceeding with this case would immediately entangle him in a massive criminal conspiracy, risking his own freedom and his lucrative legal license. Vance did not hesitate. He stood up abruptly, shoving the files back across the table. He looked directly at Judge Harrison and formally announced his immediate unconditional recusal from the case. He stated he could no longer represent Jalen due to profound ethical conflicts and the sudden presentation of severe criminal evidence. Vance did not look at my son. He snapped his leather briefcase shut, turned on his heel, and rapidly exited the chambers, abandoning Jalen entirely to his fate. Jalen sat completely alone at the long table, stripped of his legal shield, his stolen wealth, and his arrogant pride. He opened his mouth to speak, but no sound materialized. He was completely broken. Judge Harrison slammed his heavy wooden gavel against the sounding block with a deafening crack. He fiercely declared the emergency injunction entirely dismissed with prejudice. He ruled that the original 30-day eviction notice executed by my holding company was absolutely valid and immediately enforceable. The magistrate leaned forward, fixing Jalen with a stare of pure judicial disgust. He informed my son that this civil mediation was officially concluded, but his legal nightmare had just begun. Judge Harrison stated that due to the explicit evidence of federal wire fraud and systemic corruption presented in his chambers, he had taken the liberty of contacting the appropriate authorities. He pointed toward the heavy oak doors and coldly informed Jalen that 2 federal investigators were currently waiting in the outer hallway to escort him directly to a holding cell. The 30th day arrived with the grim, inescapable finality of an execution. The sky above the sprawling suburban estate hung low and heavy, blanketed in a suffocating layer of bruised, overcast gray clouds that completely obscured the morning sun. A biting, unseasonable wind ripped through the manicured oak trees lining the expansive, circular driveway, stripping the dead leaves from their branches and scattering them across the pristine, stamped concrete. 3 massive, heavy-duty commercial moving trucks idled aggressively in the center of the driveway, their enormous diesel engines rumbling with a deep mechanical vibration that physically rattled the crystal chandeliers hanging inside the grand foyer. The air smelled sharply of exhaust fumes, damp earth, and impending rain. The absolute sanctuary that Jalen and Peyton had built upon a fragile foundation of staggering corporate theft was actively being dismantled piece by piece. A crew of 12 burly, uniformed movers marched through the towering double oak doors with heavy, practiced steps carrying thick rolls of industrial packing tape, heavy moving blankets, and reinforced cardboard boxes. They moved with the cold, efficient precision of men who dismantled broken lives for a living, entirely indifferent to the manufactured prestige of the exclusive zip code. Peyton stood in the center of the cavernous marble atrium, her face twisted into a mask of pure, unadulterated hysteria. She wore dark designer athletic wear, clutching a lukewarm cup of expensive coffee in her trembling hand as she supervised the destruction of her reality. She screamed at the moving crew, her shrill, panicked voice echoing violently against the high, vaulted ceilings. She commanded them to wipe their dirty boots, demanding they handle her imported Italian leather sofas and antique French sideboards with extreme reverence. She barked orders like a deposed monarch, refusing to acknowledge the total collapse of her kingdom. She threatened to sue the moving company for any microscopic scratch inflicted upon the mahogany dining table, completely ignoring the devastating reality that she no longer possessed the financial resources to hire a basic paralegal, let alone a high-priced civil litigation attorney. Her desperate, shrieking demands fell upon entirely deaf ears. The moving crew ignored her, completely operating under strict, unyielding directives that completely invalidated her imagined authority. The foreman of the moving crew, a towering man with a thick, graying beard and arms like tree trunks, abruptly signaled for his men to halt their progress. He dropped a heavy stack of flattened cardboard boxes onto the polished marble floor and crossed his thick arms over his chest. He bluntly informed Peyton that they were strictly contracted to remove personal clothing and basic low-value personal effects. He explicitly refused to authorize his men to touch the imported Italian leather furniture, the curated collection of contemporary artwork hanging on the walls, or the massive state-of-the-art entertainment systems integrated into the residence. Peyton gasped in sheer outrage, furiously demanding a comprehensive explanation for the sudden refusal. She aggressively asserted that those luxury items were her exclusive personal property, purchased solely for her comfort and aesthetic pleasure. She ordered the foreman to load the expensive cargo immediately, or face immediate termination. The foreman simply turned his broad back on her and pointed a calloused finger out the open double doors toward the manicured front lawn. Bradley stood calmly on the damp grass, wearing a flawless navy suit and holding a thick, metal-backed clipboard. He observed the chaotic dismantling of the estate with the serene, calculating expression of an architect inspecting a demolished building. He stepped onto the porch and entered the foyer, bringing the cold autumn air inside with him. Bradley addressed Peyton with icy professional detachment. He consulted the dense manifest clipped to his board and informed her that every single piece of high-value furniture, artwork, and electronics within the residence had been purchased, utilizing blatantly embezzled corporate funds funneled through Jalen's illicit shell companies. Bradley stated with absolute, terrifying finality that these luxury assets were officially classified as stolen corporate property. They belonged legally and entirely to the freight company's holding network, completely subject to immediate corporate repossession to offset the staggering financial damages Jalen had inflicted. Sylvia materialized from the adjacent formal dining room, clutching a small, genuine leather overnight bag in her white-knuckled grip. She had watched the entire exchange with growing horror, finally comprehending the absolute, inescapable totality of their financial annihilation. She turned her venomous gaze directly onto Jalen, who stood silently near the sweeping grand staircase, looking completely hollowed out by the looming federal indictment hanging over his head. Sylvia unleashed a torrent of vicious, humiliating insults that cut through the cavernous foyer. She cursed him loudly, branding him a colossal, irredeemable failure who had systematically destroyed their immaculate social standing and dragged her daughter into a horrific criminal nightmare. She explicitly blamed his pathetic incompetence and astonishing arrogance for leaving them entirely destitute and publicly disgraced in front of their wealthy peers. Jalen did not offer a single word of defense or justification. He simply absorbed the verbal beating, his eyes fixed firmly on the polished marble floor. Peyton watched her mother berate her husband, her own expression hardening into absolute, unyielding disgust. She looked down at her left hand, staring at the massive, flawless diamond engagement ring that Jalen had purchased to secure her unwavering allegiance. The glittering stone no longer represented infinite wealth or aristocratic security. It represented federal wire fraud, impending prison sentences, and ultimate ruin. Peyton violently yanked the heavy platinum band from her finger. She marched out the front door, stepping past Bradley without breaking stride, and hurled the diamond ring directly into the thick, manicured holly bushes bordering the porch. She did not bother to see where the expensive stone landed. A bright yellow city taxi idled at the bottom of the sweeping driveway, summoned to carry them away from the seized estate. Peyton climbed into the back seat, immediately followed by Sylvia. They slammed the heavy doors shut in perfect unison, officially severing all ties to the wreckage they left behind. The taxi driver engaged the transmission, and the vehicle accelerated rapidly down the long, winding driveway. The yellow cab disappeared past the heavy wrought iron security gates, carrying Peyton and Sylvia away toward a vastly diminished reality. Jalen stepped slowly out of the grand foyer and onto the wide concrete porch. He stood completely motionless, watching the taillights fade into the gray distance. The massive commercial moving trucks shifted into gear, their heavy diesel engines roaring as they prepared to transport the final remnants of his fabricated existence into cheap temporary storage facilities. Jalen held a single battered canvas duffel bag tightly in his right hand. The bag contained a few changes of basic clothing, a pair of worn sneakers, and absolutely nothing else. Every tailored Italian suit, every luxury mechanical watch, and every tangible symbol of his stolen executive authority remained locked inside the sprawling house. officially tagged and inventoried as critical evidence of his massive corporate theft. The biting wind intensified, whipping violently across the expansive lawn and chilling him completely to the bone. A dark, threatening storm system rolled aggressively over the distant tree line, turning the morning sky the color of bruised iron. Thick drops of freezing rain began to fall, striking the stamped concrete driveway with heavy percussive smacks. Jalen stood entirely alone in the center of the massive empty driveway, the sheer scale of the towering suburban estate mocking his complete, profound isolation. He possessed absolutely no liquid cash. He had no powerful family left to manipulate. The federal authorities were actively finalizing an airtight criminal indictment that would inevitably result in a lengthy, devastating prison sentence. He stared out into the driving rain, shivering uncontrollably in the sudden cold. The illusion of his immense, untouchable power had completely evaporated, leaving him with absolutely nowhere left to hide. A brutal, torrential rainstorm hammered against the thick glass windows of my modest suburban home later that evening. The sky had unleashed a deluge, turning the quiet streets into rushing black rivers. I sat in my worn leather armchair, listening to the rhythmic drumming of the storm against the roof, finding a deep, grounding comfort in the violent weather. The heavy, relentless downpour was suddenly interrupted by a frantic, desperate pounding echoing from the front porch. The heavy wooden door shuddered under the force of the repeated blows. I set my reading glasses on the side table and walked slowly down the narrow hallway. I turned the brass deadbolt and pulled the heavy oak door inward, allowing the freezing wind and rain to sweep across the threshold. Jalen stood on my woven welcome mat, completely soaked to the bone. His expensive, custom-tailored suit clung to his shivering frame like wet paper. His meticulously styled hair was plastered flat against his pale, terrified face. The polished veneer of the untouchable corporate executive had been entirely stripped away, leaving behind nothing but a shivering, broken man. He gripped the doorframe with raw, bruised knuckles, panting heavily as the freezing rain whipped across his shoulders. Jalen collapsed to his knees right there on the damp concrete of my porch. He threw his pride away and begged his father for immediate shelter. His voice broke into ugly, guttural sobs as he frantically recounted the final devastating hours of his afternoon. He choked out the bitter reality that Peyton had systematically drained his last remaining personal checking account before officially filing for an expedited, ruthless divorce. She had taken the final scraps of his liquid capital and abandoned him to face the federal authorities completely alone. Jalen looked up at me with wide, bloodshot eyes, shivering violently in the freezing rain. He cried out my name, desperately begging for financial salvation. He begged for a second chance, pleading for the opportunity to rebuild the shattered trust between us and start over. I looked down at the man I had raised from a stubborn, difficult boy into adulthood. I searched my heart for a single trace of residual parental weakness. I found absolutely nothing. I felt no lingering anger over his massive corporate theft. I felt no burning desire for dramatic vengeance regarding his cruelty. Most importantly, I felt absolutely no pity for his current miserable predicament. I simply observed him with the cold, analytical detachment of an executive assessing a terminated liability. I calmly recounted the evening of the lavish dinner party, reminding him of the precise moment he sat at the head of a table purchased with my money and openly mocked my existence. I brought up the meticulously forged signatures on the $2 million commercial loan documents. I detailed his calculated, malicious legal strategy designed to lock me away in a secure psychiatric ward to facilitate the total theft of my corporate empire. I kept my voice perfectly level, letting the brutal reality of his own engineered treachery wash over him. I told my son that an adult must learn to survive the specific environment they deliberately engineer for themselves. I explained that I was not responsible for shielding him from the inevitable consequences of his own calculated greed. Jalen threw his hands forward, clutching at the hem of my trousers. He screamed into the storm, begging for forgiveness, insisting he was a changed man who had finally learned his lesson. I looked him directly in his tear-filled eyes. I told him to stand up and assume the consequences of his actions like a man. I stepped back into the warmth of my hallway. I closed the heavy oak door firmly against the howling wind and turned the brass deadbolt with a sharp, resounding click. The storm broke entirely by the time the sun rose the following morning, leaving the city washed clean and bathed in brilliant pale light. I drove my reliable sedan directly to the massive freight company headquarters. I bypassed the underground executive parking garage entirely and pulled into the sprawling, busy loading bays at the rear of the complex. The heavy scent of diesel and hot asphalt filled the crisp morning air. The veteran dock workers, the men and women whose sweat and dedication had actually built the foundation of this empire, paused their heavy machinery. They approached my vehicle and greeted me with genuine, unscripted warmth. They shook my hand with calloused fingers, their eyes reflecting profound respect for the man who had always valued their labor over executive posturing. I walked through the busy warehouse floor and took the service elevator directly to the 42nd floor. I bypassed the sleek glass turnstiles and walked confidently into my sprawling executive office. Bradley was already sitting at the long mahogany conference table nursing a cup of coffee. He had arranged a thick stack of finalized legal documents across the polished wood, each page flagged with yellow markers indicating the required signature lines. I sat down in my high-backed leather chair and uncapped my heavy fountain pen. I did not hesitate for a single fraction of a second. I signed the comprehensive legal paperwork, systematically transferring the vast majority shares of the entire freight logistics empire into a permanent, irrevocable employee-owned trust. I legally bound the massive corporate wealth to the dedicated workers who had physically built it permanently, shielding the assets from any future parasitic heirs or predatory corporate raiders. My legacy was permanently secured. I set the heavy fountain pen down onto the polished mahogany desk and let out a long, slow breath. The massive structural transition of the corporate empire was completely finalized. I stood up from the executive chair and walked over to the small, discreet coffee station nestled in the corner of the expansive office. I poured myself a simple, steaming cup of bitter black coffee, ignoring the expensive imported espresso machines Jalen had installed during his fraudulent tenure. The rich, dark aroma grounded me instantly, reminding me of the countless early mornings I had spent building this logistics network, from a single rusted delivery truck into a multi-million-dollar titan of municipal industry. I walked back to the center of the office and picked up the polished silver frame resting on the corner of the desk. The photograph captured Corinne on our 30th wedding anniversary. Her bright, genuine smile radiated an undeniable warmth that cut through the sterile corporate atmosphere. I traced the edge of the silver frame with my thumb. I knew with absolute certainty that she would have fiercely approved of the final decisive action I had taken to protect our foundational values. I placed the photograph back onto the desk, ensuring it held the most prominent position in the room. I walked over to the massive floor-to-ceiling plate glass windows dominating the western wall of the office. The sprawling city grid stretched out endlessly below me. I stood quietly sipping the hot, bitter coffee and watched my massive convoy of heavy freight trucks roll out of the loading bay in perfect synchronized precision. They merged seamlessly onto the interstate highway, carrying the lifeblood of the city forward. I watched the empire function perfectly, without the dead weight of entitlement holding it back. I was finally entirely at peace. True legacy is never defined by the accumulation of wealth or the inheritance of power, but by the absolute integrity with which it is carefully built and the vital wisdom to protect it from those who seek to exploit it. Greed inevitably isolates its host, stripping away authentic relationships until nothing remains but hollow ambition. Kindness and provision must always be governed by strict boundaries, lest they enable toxic dependency. A life constructed on deception will inevitably crumble under the weight of ultimate truth. True peace arrives only when you successfully secure your values and permanently walk away from betrayal. Did you find this conclusion satisfying? Leave a comment below with your thoughts and be sure to subscribe for more compelling stories.